My name is David Johnson, and 2 weeks ago, my world imploded when my wife's own mother weaponized her job at Child Protective Services to snatch our son right out of our arms. I'm 26 finance analyst at a fast-growing green energy startup in Austin. And I thought I understood injustice until CPS showed up with a court order based on lies, pinned a tiny baby sock on our front door, like a badge of terror, and drove off with our 8-month-old son. I'm telling you this because if you think your family is safe behind your white picket fence, think again. It began with a single anonymous call. I was deep into quarterly projections when Anna, my 25-year-old wife and pre-K teacher, handed me a CPS summons as if it were junk mail. "David," she whispered, voice trembling. "They're here. They want to take Mateo." My heart froze. I dropped my pen, raced downstairs, and faced a stone-faced caseworker, clipboard in hand, barely glancing at the cheerful nursery we'd spent months setting up. She didn't look at Mateo's giggles or his clean medical records from a Dr. Roth. She looked at Susan Lee's hotline notes. In that moment, I understood the power someone with insider access wields. They press a button, and your life is judged without you ever knowing why. Susan Lee is 48, once a rising star at Texas CPS, now a free agent of grief. She called their hotline 3 times in 2 weeks. Each call escalating her lies. First, she fretted over baby weight, then she claimed neglect, and finally, she accused Anna of drug use. None of it was true. CPS never checked Dr. Roth's notes, even though his 6-month checkup report sat on our kitchen table with clear "no concerns" stamped on the top. Instead, they took Mateo, pinned that sock to our door, and handed us a leaflet on supervised visits, 2 hours twice a week, under fluorescent lights, judged by strangers. I spent those visits like a caged animal, watching my own son recoil when I picked him up, then cry when I let him go. I drank coffee until sunrise, just to numb the torture. Anger consumed me until I realized fury wouldn't win my son back. I needed evidence. I hired Mark, my roommate from college and a part-time YouTuber with a knack for digital forensics. Together, we recorded every interaction video of Susan pacing outside our home at dawn, phone call logs showing CPS eschewing Dr. Roth's records, even a secret audio from a neighbor's doorbell cam capturing Susan bragging, "Trust me, they'll take him." These pieces would be our shield. Meanwhile, Anna clung to our son's wooden music box, an heirloom from his grandmother, which she said was our lullaby of resistance. That music box became more than a toy. It was a symbol of our unbreakable bond. We filed an emergency legal petition, but our public defender moved with all the urgency of molasses. Courtney Nguyen, good person, overloaded caseload. She told us these cases take 6 to 8 months. I looked at her, stunned. 8 months. That's an eternity for a baby to lose his parents. She offered condolences and a promise to file a motion to expedite, but every tick of the clock was another memory stolen. So I went public. I set up a live-stream town hall at the community center, inviting neighbors, local reporters, even CPS whistleblowers. Anna stood beside me, the music box dangling from her wrist. Her voice steady as she recounted nights spent holding that lullaby box and praying for a miracle. I presented our evidence, screenshots of calls, emails from CPS headquarters, dismissing Dr. Roth's notes, and raw clips of Susan's own admissions. Then, an unexpected twist. A CPS employee named Officer Jenkins stood up in the back row and said I was told to ignore the Roth records. I know it's wrong. He handed me an internal memo proving that former CPS specialists' tips were being fast-tracked without verification. The courtroom silence that followed was thunderous. That night, the video went viral. Messages poured in, strangers offering to testify, donations for legal fees, calls for reform. Even state legislators mentioned us in hearings. We became a rallying cry. If CPS can be hijacked by insiders, no one is safe. But with visibility came danger. 2 days later, an unmarked black sedan prowled our block, while our Ring camera captured a man in a cap, snapping a photo of our porch sock. Someone was watching, and they were pissed. The threat escalated when an envelope arrived taped to our gate, inside a printed CPS file bearing our case number and a photo of Mateo playing with the music box at daycare. No note, just proof that someone was inside those walls gathering intel. My blood ran cold, but I refused to hide. I called Carter Investigations, a private eye firm led by a former CPS tech, offering him a deal share, everything he knew about Susan's network, in exchange for immunity. He slid me a folder of bank statements showing Susan's shell companies funneling funds to CPS insiders, her text logs boasting about teaching those kids a lesson, and email blasts to former colleagues instructing them to prioritize Grandma's concerns. That dossier became our ace in the hole. With that new proof, we issued a press release. Family exposes CPS collusion insider network and false allegations, sending it to the Austin Chronicle. Highlighting the baby sock, the music box, and Carter's dossier, we framed the narrative, a grassroots fight against abuse of power. Local news picked it up, national outlets called. The county DA's office opened an inquiry, and CPS launched its own internal audit, too little too late. But our biggest victory came at the first hearing, when the judge, flipping through our folder, leaned in and said, "Mr. Johnson, this sock pinned to your door, this is a symbol of terror. I'm ordering CPS to return your son immediately and conduct no further actions until we resolve this." I felt my knees weaken as the bailiff nodded. Anna dissolved in tears, winding the music box until its melody faltered, and then we hugged in front of the stunned courtroom. We had won, but it felt surreal, like stepping out of a nightmare that never ends. We drove home with Mateo in his car seat, the world around us brighter and more fragile. The sock and music box sat side by side on the dashboard, tokens of our darkest days and our greatest triumph. Yet as we pulled into our driveway, I noticed an envelope wedged in the doorframe, a demand for over $10,000 in unpaid fees from CPS, citing damage to government property and defamation. No signature, just a threat. I parked the car, set Anna and Mateo inside, and stepped onto the porch. My heart hammered. Who would send such a letter? Susan Lee, CPS. The same network that nearly stole my son. I reached for the envelope, thumb poised over the seal, and paused. Because I realized our battle had only just begun. Returning Mateo was a victory, but defeating a system corrupted from the inside would require more than fury or evidence. It would demand unrelenting strategy, alliances we hadn't yet forged, and sacrifices I hadn't yet imagined. I took a breath, ripped the envelope open, and pulled out a single sheet. Final warning: cease and desist, or face full legal consequences. No names, no signatures, only the shadow of a threat. Every instinct screamed to fight back, to expose them again. But standing on that porch, sock and music box at my feet, I felt the weight of a father's promise. I would protect my son no matter the cost, and I would not be intimidated. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. I would call every tipster, interview every insider, and build a coalition strong enough to purge CPS of its rot. I would turn fear into action, rage into reform, and ensure that no other family would endure the hell we survived. The dawn would bring subpoenas, depositions, and political pressure. And in that crucible, we would either break the system or it would break us. But as darkness settled and the porch light cast long shadows across the lawn, I clenched my fist and whispered to the night, "Bring it on." The next morning, the sun rose over our fenced yard like a judge's gavel, sharp, unwavering, demanding attention. When I stepped outside, the envelope from last night still lay on the porch, its edges damp with dew. I picked it up, glancing around as though whoever sent it might materialize from the maple shadows. Inside was a terse letter on plain letterhead. "You have 48 hours to retract your public statements and cease all litigation, or CPS will pursue punitive damages and criminal contempt charges. Legal Affairs. Travis County CPS. No signature, no judge's name, just a cold threat." I slammed the door and jogged to the garage, where Mark was already assembling his camera rig. "They've escalated," I told him, tossing the letter on his workbench. He read it, face darkening. "Looks like Susan's network is circling the wagons. They're wielding CPS resources to intimidate you." He tapped the letter. "This is a bluff. CPS can't press criminal contempt against you for suing them under oath. But it tells you where they'll strike next: your wallet, your reputation, your willpower." I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "We need to flip this, make their threat public, expose that CPS is misusing legal power." Mark loaded batteries into a shotgun mic. "Exactly. Let's record your response for social media." Innocent until proven guilty doesn't apply when insiders can weaponize CPS. I strapped on a GoPro to stream live from the porch. My heart pounded as I hit go live on my phone. Hey everyone, David Johnson here. Last night we got a final warning from CPS Legal Affairs. They're threatening me with contempt and punitive damages unless I shut up about my son's kidnapping. Let me be clear, they're abusing their power. The comments lit up. This is outrageous. Stay strong. We've got your back. I felt a surge of resolve. Tomorrow I file a motion to unseal their internal communications and subpoena the identities behind this letter. If they're going to threaten me, I'll make them answer in open court. We streamed for 15 minutes, walking viewers through the envelope, the typed threat, and my plan. When I signed off, Mark clapped. That's how you own the narrative. I exhaled, adrenaline still blazing. Now let's get to work. By mid-morning, I was at the Travis County Clerk's office filing 2 motions, one to unseal CPS internal legal memos regarding my case, another to compel production of personnel records for Susan Lee and her inner circle. The clerk barely glanced at the cover sheets before stamping them. Filed. I walked out feeling the first true flicker of power law works when you use it. Next, I headed to Anna's school, dropping off fresh cupcakes for her pre-K students and meeting the principal, Ms. Rodriguez. I wanted to thank you for your support, Anna said quietly as children spilled in. I shook Ms. Rodriguez's hand. She squeezed Anna's arm. Your family's courage is inspiring our entire staff. We're organizing a letter-writing campaign to the state legislature for CPS reform. I felt pride for Anna. Her battle was small hands teaching young minds, yet her fight for justice was just as vital as mine in the courtroom. That afternoon, I joined Karen at her office for strategy. She laid out the briefs. Once we unseal CPS memos, we'll prove that their threats were orchestrated by Susan Lee's Legal Affairs Desk, an entity that shouldn't exist under state rules. I flipped through her notes, emails, scheduling clandestine meetings at the CPS Training Center, budget line items for external counsel, with Susan's initials penciled beside them, transcripts of Susan instructing juniors to tighten the screws on the Johnson matter. It was smoking gun evidence. We need a hearing date for our unsealing motion, ASAP, Karen said. I'll push for a hearing next week. Meanwhile, Mark was at our house editing a second video, a deep dive into CPS budget, exposing how millions earmarked for child services were diverted to legal contingencies. We cut in the baby sock and music box as visual motifs: safety and innocence at risk from bureaucratic greed. The draft previewed at 7:00 p.m. and got my approval. We queued it for upload at midnight, captioned, CPS corruption exposed, see the money trail. I knew that by morning, the county's press would be buzzing. That night, dinner was rushed leftover tacos and tired smiles. Emma tested a trumpet solo in her room. Jake scrolled through notifications. Sarah checked her messages. County Commissioner wants to meet local news, wants interview. She looked up, eyes bright. This is real, David. They're taking us seriously. I reached across, touched her hand. Because we made them. In the early hours, Mark's video went live. I woke to a barrage of alerts, Facebook, Twitter, Nextdoor, local news sites. The Travis County Monitor ran a teaser: citizen unveils CPS financial sleight of hand. I clicked through, heart pounding. Our video had 50,000 views in 2 hours. Comments ranged from outrage to support to angry accusations that I was defaming CPS. But the analytics showed a majority trending pro-reform. I forwarded the link to Karen. Check your email for media inquiries. At 9:00 a.m., I was back at the courthouse for the unsealing hearing. The judge, a deliberate, no-nonsense woman named Judge Patel, called the case at 9:15. Karen moved to unseal. CPS's attorney, a gray-haired civil litigator named McKinnon, argued in hushed tones that internal budget items and personnel notes were confidential personnel matters. Judge Patel turned to me. Mr. Johnson, these documents relate to public interest in a case of alleged governmental abuse. I see more need for transparency than secrecy. Her gavel fell. Motion granted. CPS shall produce all relevant legal affairs documents by next Wednesday. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I caught Ms. Rodriguez's eyes in the gallery. She mouthed, Yes, across the aisle. McKinnon scribbled furiously. Courthouse steps were a blur of reporters shouting questions. I fielded them calmly. Judge Patel's decision is a victory for every Texan who values government accountability. Then I slipped into the car, exhausted but elated. Back home, I found a UPS box on the porch CPS's production. I brought it inside like a prized trophy. Inside were 5 binders filled with emails, memos, financial spreadsheets, and meeting minutes. At the top was a memo titled, Operation Thumbscrew Johnson Response Team. It outlined a week-by-week escalation plan to discredit me, drain my resources, and intimidate my family. Page after page detailed Susan Lee's directives to pressure numerically weak targets us into submission. I sank into the sofa, holding the baby sock in one hand, the music box in the other, tears welling. This was their playbook, a confession that they'd abused power for personal vendettas. I felt righteous fury surge through me. We had rendered their tactics transparent, and soon their corruption would be on record. I texted Mark and Karen, "We've got the blueprints. Time to blow this wide open." From beside me, Anna emerged with Mateo asleep in her arms. She saw the binders, the sock, my expression. She set the music box beside him and sat down. "What did they send?" I handed her the top memo. Her eyes widened as she read. "They actually have a playbook." I nodded, voice low but steady. "And now it's their turn to play by the rules." Anna brushed Mateo's hair back, humming the lullaby. She looked up at me. "We expose every page, every author, every line." I wrapped an arm around her, feeling more powerful than I had since this nightmare began. "We will." But as I stared at the binders, I recognized the moment's gravity. We held their secrets. Yes, but with that came responsibility. If we released everything unchecked, innocent employees might be swept up in prosecutions, and public trust in CPS could collapse entirely. We had to wield this knowledge wisely to target the real culprits, protect the children who counted on the system's good parts. I took a breath, imagining the next steps, sorting the media release, setting up narrow subpoenas to back up our civil suit, coordinating with state legislators for targeted reform bills. The binders on my lap weighed like bricks of destiny, and as Anna wound the music box again, its melody a quiet promise. I felt the future hinge on our next move. Would we use these documents to dismantle a corrupt network? Or would we risk destroying an institution vital to child welfare? I closed my eyes, the lullaby's final notes echoing in the silent room. Then I opened them, resolute. "We're going to do this right," I said softly. And in that moment, I vowed we would save the system from its worst actors and ensure no parent ever felt the terror of that tiny sock on their door. Tomorrow, the binders would go public in measured release. Subpoenas would lock down the real villains. Reform legislation would be drafted. And we would watch together as the walls of corruption crumbled brick by crooked brick. Thursday morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing text messages from state legislators, reporters, even a child advocacy nonprofit offering support. The binders of CPS Operation Thumbscrew lay open on my dining room table, their contents casting long shadows in the early light, email chains scheduling clandestine strategy sessions, budget line items for legal contingency coded to Susan Lee's initials, and lists naming every staffer tapped to carry out intimidation tactics. But I couldn't linger on the shock. I had work to do. First, I dialed my attorney, Karen Burke. "We need a controlled release," I told her. "Let's draft a targeted press advisory that exposes the network leaders, Susan Lee, her legal counsel, McKinnon, and their inner circle, but shield frontline CPS workers who had nothing to do with it." She agreed. "We'll bundle the advisory with redacted binders, summarize the criminal tactics, and emphasize reforms, whistleblower protections, transparent budgeting, removal of insider legal affairs from CPS's structure, and we'll copy key committees in the Texas legislature." Karen's precision eased my nerves. Our fight had courtroom rules, and we'd honor them. By midday, Mark arrived with his gear. We recorded an on-camera statement on our front porch, me in a polo shirt, the baby sock pinned to my jacket lapel, Anna standing behind me with Mateo in her arms, the wooden music box topping the table. I spoke directly to the camera. "Today we release evidence of systemic corruption inside Travis County CPS. This is not a witch hunt against caseworkers doing good work. It's a targeted exposé of those who abused their power for personal revenge. We demand that Susan Lee and her co-conspirators be removed, that CPS's budget be audited, and that protective measures be enacted so no family endures the terror we lived. Mark captured the moment as birds chirped in the background, lending a surreal calm to my heated words. Within minutes of uploading, the advisory and redacted binders circulated across local news sites and social media channels. Comments poured in, calls for CPS director resignation, support for targeted reforms, even threats of class action suits by other affected families. I watched the public outrage climb like a storm. By afternoon, the Travis County Commissioner's Office announced an emergency hearing on CPS oversight. The political pressure needle had moved from zero to critical, but as the public swell grew, I sensed a countermove in motion. Late that afternoon, court papers arrived. Horizons Counsel, no CPS's internal lawyers, filed for a protective order to seal certain binders claiming personnel privacy, and ongoing criminal investigations justified confidentiality. I scowled at the page. The same people who orchestrated the threats were now hiding behind gag orders. I called Karen. Will oppose it on grounds of public interest and absence of any legitimate privacy claim for a state agency. Let's push back Friday morning. Meanwhile, Anna received an email from Susan Lee's personal attorney, a cease and desist demanding we remove her name and reputation from all public documents threatening libel suits. His exact words, CPS insiders have immunity from defamation when acting in official capacity. It was a ludicrous claim, but typical of tyrants hiding behind bureaucracy. Anna forwarded it to me, face pale. They really are digging in. I took her hand. We'll outlast them. Friday dawned gray and chilly. I arrived early at the Travis County Commissioner's hearing, armed with binders in hand and keys to the city's narrative. The room filled quickly, child advocates, local parents, lawyers, and a phalanx of reporters. On the dais sat 3 commissioners flanked by CPS Director Monique Hastings, looking strained in her navy suit. I took the podium when called, heart thudding. Commissioners, thank you for convening this emergency oversight hearing. I stand before you, not as an adversary of CPS caseworkers who do vital work, but as a concerned parent and citizen. I present evidence of a closed clique within CPS, led by former specialist Susan Lee, that weaponized the system to terrorize my family. Their playbook is thumbscrew, targeting my wife and me, abusing legal processes to extort us into silence and subverting CPS's mission. I clicked through slides, the redacted binders, the email from Susan's lawyer maps showing her secret meetings, and the photo of the baby sock on our door. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Commissioner Ramirez leaned forward. Mr. Johnson, if your allegations hold true, that is an appalling breach of public trust. Director Hastings. How do you respond, Hastings? Rose's voice measured. Commissioners, we are reviewing these materials. We have already placed Susan Lee on administrative leave pending full investigation. We will cooperate fully with the state audit and implement reforms, including removing all legal affairs functions from CPS and establishing an independent oversight committee. I watched her carefully. Her resignation of Susan was the first sign of accountability, but her promise of an independent committee would need legislative backing. I needed to seize that moment. After Hastings sat, I spoke again. Thank you, Director. I urge this body to enact immediate legislative reforms. 1, ban all former CPS employees from holding litigation or legal affairs roles for at least 5 years post-employment. 2, create statutory whistleblower protections so insiders can safely report misconduct. 3, mandate transparency in all CPS legal budgeting and external counsel contracts. These steps will prevent another family from facing what we endured. The commissioners nodded, scribbling notes. When the hearing concluded, reporters swarmed. Mr. Johnson, will you testify at the legislative session? What about criminal charges against Susan Lee? Do you feel safe returning to your home? I answered, each weaving the binder's revelations into a narrative of justice, not vengeance. By dusk, news outlets ran headlines, parent exposes thumbscrew scheme in CPS. Officials pledge reform. Back home, I collapsed into my desk chair, exhausted but electrified. Anna appeared with snacks and a tight hug. You were incredible, I exhaled. We built a fire that can't be doused. But as I absorbed the victory, I saw the deeper challenge pushing commissioners to draft and pass those reforms. Politics moves slower than outraged news cycles. I would need allies in Austin at the state capitol and a coalition of advocates. The binders would be our proof of concept. When you pull back the curtain, people demand change. Saturday morning dawned with rain spattering the windows. I met with a lobbyist friend Marco for coffee. He'd worked on education bills in the legislature and offered to shepherd our reform package. I'll draft the language for the Whistleblower Act and coordinate with Representative Nguyen on filing it next week. Marco's confidence made me believe a bill could clear committee by summer. I felt momentum shifting from crisis response to systemic overhaul. That afternoon, I joined a community town hall at the public library hosted by local nonprofits. I shared the thumbscrew folder with attendees, walked them through proposed reforms, and gathered signatures for a petition to Speaker Phelan. Parents, attorneys, educators, and even a few ex-CPS workers pledged support. Each signature was a brick in the foundation of sustainable change. That evening, I lingered alone at the library, shelving the last petitions, switching off lights, feeling the hush of books around me. I thought of Susan Lee's litany of intimidation of the family she almost destroyed, and of how far we'd come from that first CPS visit. The binders lay open in my bag, raw evidence of collusion. But now they signaled possibility, not just outrage. I closed them carefully, like a coffin lid shutting on wrongdoing, then locked them in a secure drawer at home. Driving back under umbrellas and streetlights, I realized that our personal nightmare had catalyzed a broader movement. But with that power came responsibility to shepherd reforms, support presenters, and maintain public focus. The system's inertia could swallow our efforts if we let up, and I knew too well the cost of complacency. That night back at home, I placed the baby sock and music box together on the mantle. Their symbols had evolved. The sock was death of trust, the music box defiance of silence. And now they stood guard over a new symbol, a draft reform bill in my hand, marked Texas CPS Transparency Act. I read its title, heart-swelling. This was our next battle, our inheritance. As I typed an email to Marco with suggested bill amendments, a late-night news alert popped up CPS Director Hastings to testify in Senate committee on Monday. The date was circled on my calendar. A chill ran down my spine. This was our moment to escalate to statewide attention. I closed my laptop, turned down the lights, and inhaled deeply. Tomorrow would demand fresh courage and coalition building. And as the rain pattered on the window, I whispered to myself, "We're just getting started." Monday dawned gray and humid as I navigated the Austin traffic toward the state capitol, the CPS Transparency Act draft in my passenger seat beside a stack of binders. Today, CPS Director Monique Hastings would testify before the Senate Committee on Child Welfare, and I had a front row seat. I parked at the visitor lot, flashed my legislative pass, and ascended the marble steps, each one echoing my steps toward systemic change. Inside the cool corridors, hummed with activity aides, rushing with coffee trays, committee clerks shuffling files, lobbyists in crisp suits debating amendments. I spotted Representative Lynn Nguyen, my legislative champion, and we exchanged a quick fist bump. "They're setting up in room E2 in 012, she said. "You ready?" I inhaled, steeled myself, and nodded. More than ever, room E2.012 was a vaulted chamber with oak benches and brass nameplates. Senators filed in, donning reading glasses and serious expressions. Hastings sat at the witness table, flanked by counsel. I took a seat in the gallery, behind parents and advocates who'd flown in from Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. When Chairman Evans called the committee to order, the sudden hush felt like the moment before a thunderclap. Chairman Evans opened with courtesy. Director Hastings, "Thank you for joining us. CPS's mandate is child safety. Recent allegations suggest a subset of employees may have abused that power. Please explain CPS's actions regarding the Johnson case and steps taken in response." Hastings stood, voice measured. Chairman Senator CPS deeply regrets the trauma inflicted on the Johnson family. Following the investigation, we placed Susan Lee and her associates on leave engaged an external auditor for our legal affairs division, and began implementing reforms, including whitelisting whistleblower channels and restricting external legal contracts. She passed out a multi-page summary of reforms, 10 points ranging from budget transparency to mandatory ethics training. I leaned forward watching the senators' faces. Some nodded, others scribbled. Then Senator Martinez, the committee's skeptic, cleared his throat. Director Hastings, these measures are commendable, but they are reactive. How do we ensure CPS proactively prevents such abuses? And why did it take public exposure for CPS to act? Hastings swallowed, glanced down at her notes. Senator, we acknowledge our response was delayed. We underestimated the risk of insider collusion. Effective today, we are establishing a permanent Inspector General's office within CPS empowered to conduct unannounced audits and enforce disciplinary action without managerial interference. A murmur swept the room, and IGO was unprecedented. I felt my heart thunder. This was a major win. Sen! Martinez pressed on. And what protections exist for employees who report misconduct? Are they shielded from retaliation? Hastings nodded firmly. Under our new policy, any staffer who reports wrongdoing is granted immediate administrative leave and counsel support pending investigation. Retaliation is grounds for termination. A few committee members exchanged impressed looks. Then Senator Carlisle, a rural senator, with quiet gravitas, asked, "What role did CPS legal counsel play in the Johnson intimidation letter?" Hastings's eyes flickered. "That matter is under criminal and administrative review. I cannot comment on ongoing proceedings." The chair adjourned before Senator Carlisle could follow up. As the gavel fell, the gallery erupted. Parents stood applauding. I joined in, though the uncertainty in Hastings's answer tugged at me. Under criminal review could mean indefinite stalling. I would need to keep pressure on that front. I caught Representative Nguyen's eye. She mouthed bills next. Outside reporters swarmed. I stepped up to microphones. Today's hearing shows CPS can reform, but public vigilance is essential. The Transparency Act will codify these reforms into law, ensuring no director can backslide. Cameras flashed. I ducked into a hallway phone, already buzzing with news alerts. By afternoon, I reconvened with Karen Burke in her office. We pored over draft amendments, inserting IGO funding lines, tightening reporting requirements, and specifying penalties for obstruction of oversight, up to criminal contempt for any CPS official who withholds documents. "This is good," Karen said, highlighting text. "But we need to shore up judicial enforcement. Let's add a clause allowing families to bring private lawsuits under a new cause of action for abuse of protective power." I exhaled. Yes, civil remedies alongside criminal deterrence. We revised the draft, then I emailed it to Representative Nguyen for tomorrow's markup session. That evening, Sarah and I held a planning call with our Coalition Child Advocacy Nonprofits Legal Aid Clinics union reps and 2 brave ex-CPS employees who'd testified for us. We reviewed talking points, divided outreach districts, and scheduled phone banks to contact every senator before the bill's committee vote. When we hung up, fatigue and hope warred in my chest. I looked at the baby sock pinned by magnet to our fridge and the music box on the counter. They'd become icons for reform. Tomorrow, they'd become symbols of a movement. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the Capitol's Annex for the Senate Health and Human Services Committee markup. The conference room buzzed with aides, lobbyists, press, and a handful of skeptical legislators. Representative Nguyen introduced the bill senators. The CPS Transparency Act codifies reforms to prevent abuse of power, protect whistleblowers, and ensure government accountability. I moved to insert Amendment A regarding the IGO's funding and independence. She flipped to the relevant page. Aides passed out redlined text. Then Senator Carlisle stood. I'd propose adding language to direct the IGO to report to both the governor's office and legislative oversight to prevent executive capture. A brief negotiation followed. Nguyen accepted Carlisle's amendment. Next, Senator Martinez objected to civil lawsuits. This adds a torrent of litigation burdens on CPS, detracting from its mission. I stood to speak. Senator, with respect, this mechanism holds the system accountable. If fear of meritless suits were a concern, The bill includes a requirement that judges dismiss frivolous actions early and award costs against bad faith plaintiffs. Martinez considered, then said, "We'll see how the amendment works in practice." He allowed it to stand. The markup continued through the morning debates on budget lines, sunset dates for the IGO, and definitions of insider misconduct. Each point required bridging partisan gaps metrics for breach of protective duty, harmonized with GOP calls for efficiency, while DFL senators secured funding for rural CPS offices. By lunchtime, the committee approved the act by a 7-2 vote, sending it to the full Senate. The clerk's office stamped it, postponed until Friday for second reading. Outside, cheers broke out among our coalition. I shook hands with Senator Carlisle, who said quietly, "You did good work." I thanked him. As our group posed for photos, I felt the tide shifting from crisis containment to lawmaking. But the bill had to survive the Senate floor, a House committee, and the governor's desk. Each step could derail the reforms. That afternoon, I practiced testimony for Friday's full Senate session. Karen drilled me on tough questions. What safeguards prevent IGO from becoming another bureaucracy? How do you ensure civil suits aren't abused? I rehearsed clear, concise answers. Our binders and the documented thumbscrew scheme were my proof points. By 5:00 p.m., I felt prepared. Back home, Sarah had organized a community fundraiser, an outdoor concert featuring local bands and parents speaking about the bill. As dusk fell, neighbors streamed in, picnic blankets in tow. Emma played her trumpet at twilight. Children chased glow sticks. I took the mic to thank everyone. This isn't just our fight, it's our community's fight. We've shown that one family's nightmare can spark statewide reform. Let's keep the pressure until this bill becomes law. The crowd cheered voices, melding into a powerful chorus of hope. That night, after the last glow stick flickered out, I stood alone in the empty lawn, the stars overhead like distant watchful eyes. I thought of Susan Lee and her legal network. The binders locked away in my study. The baby sock and music box shining under porch lights. The system was changing, but the road ahead was perilous. Friday's full Senate debate could unravel everything with a well-placed amendment or procedural delay. And even if the bill past implementation required ongoing oversight to prevent new abuses, I inhaled tasting autumn in the air and let the music box's melody play softly from the porch. Its gentle notes reminded me that change often begins with a single voice daring to speak truth. We had amplified ours to a roar, and now we had to channel that roar into law. As I headed inside, I whispered to the night, "Tomorrow we bring this to the chamber." No turning back. Friday dawned bright and clear, but inside the Senate chamber, the atmosphere crackled with tension. I arrived early, buttoning my navy blazer and smoothing the baby sock pinned to my lapel. Its faded cotton, a stark reminder of our family's ordeal. The committee's favorable vote had been a triumph, but now the full Senate would debate the CPS Transparency Act. Every senator's vote mattered. A single defection could derail months of effort. As I stepped into the ornate hall, gold leaf filigree oak benches, and banners proclaiming "Servants of the People," I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. I spotted Rep. Lin Nguyen at the front row, her notes arranged in neat columns and waved. A handful of parents' advocates and former CPS workers sat behind me, their eyes shining with hope and apprehension. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was not just about our family. It was about every child and parent who'd ever looked to CPS for protection. If we failed here, the door would remain open for insiders to twist the system again. Senate President pro tempore Jackson called the session to order. Senators filed in, the sergeant-at-arms tapping his mace against the rostrum to signify order. Jackson read the bill title, "An Act to Enhance Transparency and Accountability within the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services." Then he called on Senator Martinez to open debate. Martinez, who had raised concerns about civil lawsuits, stood and delivered a measured critique. While I support increased oversight, I worry that civil action provisions invite a flood of litigation that distracts CPS from its core mission. We must calibrate our reforms to avoid hamstringing caseworkers who are already overburdened. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some nodding in agreement, others frowning. When Martinez sat, Chairman Evans rose to defend the bill. His voice was firm. "Senator Martinez, we appreciate your concern. That is why Section 12 of the bill includes strict informa, pauperous standards, and fee shifting to deter frivolous claims. The primary deterrent is transparency. When agencies know their actions are subject to independent oversight, they are less likely to stray." He cited data from other states showing that while lawsuits did increase, meritless suits were swiftly dismissed, and the net effect was safer children and fairer outcomes. There was diplomatic applause. Next, Senator Carlisle, who had championed the IGO reporting structure, spoke in favor. "Our constitutional obligation is to protect Texans. This bill embeds checks and balances within CPS itself, a living firewall against abuse. I urge its passage." His support carried weight across party lines. But then came the turning point. Senator Howard, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, rose with a stack of budget sheets. "Mr. President, I understand the spirit of this legislation," he said, voice echoing off marble. "But the cost of establishing and staffing an independent inspector general's office, coupled with legal aid funding for private suits, comes to $12 million annually. This year's budget deficit cannot accommodate that." A hush fell. Without Howard's sign-off, the bill might die for lack of funding. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The binders of Operation Thumbscrew lay between my seat and the aisle, real proof of why we needed this IGO. If the debate stalled here, those documents became moot. I rose to speak, heart hammering. The gavel tapped twice, permission granted. "Mr. President, members of the Senate." I began, voice steady, though my palms were damp. "I am a Texan who believed in the promise of CPS until insiders used it to steal my son. This bill is not an abstract expense. It is an investment in the safety and well-being of Texas's most vulnerable. Consider this the cost of one wrongfully removed child, including foster care expenses, legal fees. Trauma counseling easily exceeds the budget of this entire office." I held up one binder for all to see. "Here is the thumbscrew plan and insider's handbook for betraying public trust. How much will that betrayal cost our state? Let us redirect a fraction of those diverted funds back into a system that protects, not manipulates our families." I paused, letting my words hang in the air. The chamber was silent, save for the gentle shuffle of papers. Then, unexpectedly, Senator Howard cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, your testimony underscores the stakes. I propose an amendment fund the IGO by reallocating existing external contract attorney budgets, zero net new spending." A murmur of surprise swept through. Howard held up his spreadsheet. "We can reduce legal contingency spending, currently grossly inflated by 40%, and channel those dollars into the watchdog office." Senators exchanged impressed looks. The finance chair was pivoting. Evans thanked Howard and directed staff to draft the amendment. Within minutes, pages rustled as scribes integrated the changes. After a brief recess, the draft amendment was read aloud and Howard moved its adoption. The vote was unanimous. Applause broke out not just for the amendment, but for the bill's continued viability. The session resumed. Now, with funding secured, the debate turned to the civil suit provisions. Senator Martinez proposed minor tweaks, raising dismissal thresholds requiring a mediation step before lawsuits. But no senator sought to strike the private cause of action entirely. When the final roll call vote came, the bill passed 29-2. My heart leapt. I sank back into my seat as the gallery erupted in cheering. I spotted Anna, tears sliding down her cheeks, and our former CPS employees standing and roaring their approval. Senate President Jackson pronounced, "The bill passes the Senate. It shall be certified and transferred to the House for concurrence." The gavel banged. I rose, shaking hands with lawmakers, absorbing the magnitude we'd steered a path through partisan hurdles, budgetary fears, and legal skepticism to secure systemic protection for every Texan child. But the road wasn't over. The House would need to adopt the amendments, then the governor's signature. There was a risk of dilution in the lower chamber, or a veto. As I left the Capitol, the binders pressed against my side. I knew the next step demanded strategic vigilance in Austin and every district office. That afternoon, Rep. Nguyen and I convened our coalition for an emergency strategy session at the state party headquarters. Maps lined the walls, house districts color-coded by support levels, contact lists for each representative, and timelines for committee hearings. We divided tasks. Call the 7 swing districts, secure editorial board endorsements, mobilize grassroots calls. I felt the surge of collective purpose. Hundreds of volunteers, legal minds, CPS alumni, and community activists rallying to secure a law that would outlast any one term. By evening, I returned home bone-tired but exhilarated. Sarah greeted me with a hug and news. The Dallas Morning News editorial board just endorsed the bill. Emma bounded up with a flyer peg. "We did it," scrawled in rainbow marker. Jake patted my shoulder. "Proud of you, Dad?" I kissed them all, feeling their faith reinforce mine. This wasn't just my fight, it was ours. That night, I placed the baby sock and music box side by side on the mantel. Tomorrow I'd travel to the House chamber, ready to mirror our Senate strategy. I laid out the binders on my desk, highlighting key pages. Then I closed the door, leaving them under lock and key for security. As I lay in bed, sleep eluded me until the baby's soft coos drifted through the monitor. Sarah exhaled beside me. "Tomorrow brings the vote," she whispered. I shut my eyes, heart full. We had built momentum, forged alliances, and secured Senate passage. Now, in the crucible of the House and the governor's pen, our victory would be tested one final time. And as the city lights winked beyond our window, I murmured into the darkness, "We have come too far to fail now." Monday morning, the air in Austin buzzed with urgency as I stepped off the Capitol Metro Rail and walked across the sun-bleached plaza toward the Texas House of Representatives. The CPS Transparency Act, reborn with Senate-approved amendments, now faced its final hurdle. The House chamber. I clutched the worn binders in my arms like shields, the baby sock pinned to my lapel, the wooden music box's lullaby humming softly in my mind. Each step felt heavy with expectation. This was the moment when protest became law, when a family's nightmare would yield real, enforceable protection or crumble under procedural delay. Inside the House gallery, I took a seat behind the press benches. Below, representatives filled the chamber's green leather seats, flipping through pocket-sized journals and conferring in low tones. I spotted Representative Lynn Nguyen on the dais, flanked by her co-author, Representative Marcus Bell, a conservative ally who'd championed the finance amendment. Across the aisle, I saw skeptical faces, some nursing doubts about enforcement costs and liability concerns. I closed my eyes for a second, imagining the binder's contents. The Operation Thumbscrew memos, the budgets funneling money into intimidation, the anonymous threat letters. I drew a steadying breath. Failure was not an option. At 10 a.m., Speaker Watson called the session to order. The clerk read the bill caption, and Watson recognized Representative Nguyen to open debate. Nguyen's voice rang clear, "Madam Speaker, colleagues, this legislation embodies our duty to protect children and support caseworkers by ensuring transparency, accountability, and recourse against those who would betray the public trust. It is not anti-CPS, it is pro-child, pro-family, and pro-government integrity." She laid out the bill's key points. IGO funding reallocated from external legal budgets, whistleblower protections, civil remedies with safeguards against frivolous suits, and concluded, "I urge a yes vote to restore faith in the system." A chorus of "hear, hear" rose from one side of the aisle. Then Representative Hernandez stood wearing the pin of a child advocacy nonprofit. As someone who lost my own niece to neglect, I know the cost of inaction. This bill gives families a fighting chance. More applause, but doubt lingered in the chamber's corners. Rep. C.G. Baxter, chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, rose cautiously. "While I support transparency, this bill's mechanisms overlap with existing oversight by the State Auditor's Office. I propose Amendment C merge the IGO with the Auditor's Child Services Division to avoid duplication. Heads turned if merged, independence risked compromise." I gripped the binder's heart pounding as Nguyen and Bell exchanged quick glances. When Baxter's amendment came to a vote, Nguyen rose to speak. "Consolidation sounds efficient, but it nullifies the IGO's independence. Imagine a fox guarding the henhouse twice over. Children need an inspector answerable to neither CPS nor the auditor's political hierarchy." A hush fell, then murmurings of agreement. The amendment failed 75-57. Relief washed through me. The IGO would stand on its own. Next came Representative Moore, who questioned the civil suit provisions. What safeguards exist to prevent opportunistic lawsuits that tie up CPS caseworkers' time? Nguyen gestured to Bell, who explained the fee shift clauses, mandatory mediation, and early dismissal low thresholds for meritless claims. Moore nodded grudgingly. The debate wound on each speaker weighing children's safety against liability fears. After 2 hours, Speaker Watson called for final passage. The clerk took roll call. I held my breath as names lit up the board one by one. Aye, no aye. And then, when the last name appeared, aye. The count 98-32, with 2 present not voting. The chamber erupted in applause. I swallowed a lump in my throat, eyes blazing, as I saw Nguyen beam Bell fist pump and advocates in the gallery standing and cheering. When the gavel fell, the bill's fate rested with Governor Abbott. Within hours, Nguyen's office emailed me, sent to Governor, for signature. The binders felt impossibly light as I slung them over my shoulder. I stepped out into the glow of late afternoon, where a group of parents and advocates had gathered to celebrate. We raised water bottles in a toast, no champagne, just cold water from Nalgene bottles, but it tasted like victory. That evening, Sarah and I hosted a private gathering at our home family, Mark, Karen, Burke, Repton, Gwen, and a handful of advocates. We cooked tacos on the grill, kids played in the yard, and the music box's lullaby tinkled from the porch. At 7:00 p.m., my phone buzzed. Governor Abbott has signed the CPS Transparency Act into law. My breath caught as I read the official announcement. Effective immediately creation of the CPS Inspector General's Office, whistleblower protections, civil cause of action, and mandated budget transparency. Texas leads the nation in safeguarding child welfare systems. I looked up at Sarah, tears streaming. We hugged the binders, dropping at our feet like confetti. But celebration came with a sobering twist. The governor's signing statement included a reservation implementation subject to appropriations from unencumbered funds. In other words, if the legislature failed to allocate the money, the law would stand on paper, but the IGO might remain unfunded. My chest tightened. The victory was real, but the next battle lay in implementation budget negotiations in the upcoming session. I took to my phone, dialing Rep. Nguyen. We have the law. Now we need funding. She promised to push the appropriation in the Legislative Budget Committee and secure support from the governor's office. I felt the urgency a new law without action is mere ink on a page. Over the next week, I met with budget analysts, nonprofit leaders, and even CPS caseworker unions to build a coalition advocating for the IGO's funding. We delivered thousands of petition signatures to the Legislative Budget Board, held press conferences highlighting stories of families still traumatized by Operation Thumbscrew, and placed op-eds in the Tribune. Each effort reinforced that this law was not a ceremonial gesture, it was a mandate for real change. Meanwhile, the DOL investigation into CPS's potential erase analog misuse of public trust drifted forward, its scope extended to include penal code referrals for Susan Lee and her co-conspirators. As the story returned to headlines, I recognized the cycle we would need to shepherd enforcement and prosecutions alongside implementation of reforms. 2 months later, under a gray winter sky, I stood in a sparsely populated hearing room as the new CPS Inspector General, Aisha Brooks, testified before the Legislative Budget Board. She laid out a $9.2 million request for staffing investigations and training directly sourced from reduced CPS legal contract line items. She unveiled her initial audit plan's timelines for policy rollouts and mechanisms for whistleblower intake. The board approved with minimal opposition, solidifying the act's teeth. I exhaled, realizing the culmination of our fight, from the terror of a lone sock pinned to our door, to exposing a corrupt network, to passing a law that rebuilt the firewall of accountability around CPS. Standing behind IG Brooks, I felt a fierce pride in what a determined parent, a community coalition, and the rule of law could accomplish together. That night, as snow began to dust our yard, I placed the baby sock and music box side by side on the mantel once more, and between them, a framed copy of the CPS Transparency Act, signed and sealed. The symbols of fear and resistance now stood guard beside the instrument of reform. I wound the music box softly, its melody a promise that innocence and justice would endure. But as the lullaby played, I knew the work wasn't over. Laws must be defended, budgets guarded, and implementation monitored. New threats could emerge, and bureaucracies can ossify. I took Sarah's hand, looked at the framed act, and whispered, "We did this. Now let's keep watch." Together, in the quiet glow of our living room, we affirmed our commitment to safeguard every family, to challenge every abuse of power, and to ensure that no parent would ever wake up to that nightmare sock again. The battle had ended, but the campaign for integrity in government would continue day after day, lullaby by lullaby.